Going across the road, but I didn't quite see the out. They were out here yesterday, third quarter. Welcome. We'd like to congratulate Steve Beckley and the Glenwood Caverns Adventure Park for being named the U.S. Chamber Blue Ribbon Small Business Award winner. Glenwood Caverns Adventure Park was selected from a record number of applicants from communities across the nation for demonstrating exceptional business practices in areas including strategic planning, employee development, community involvement, and customer service. As a Blue Ribbon winner, voting is now open for the Community Excellence Award. So visit the Chamber's Facebook page to learn about how to cast your vote for Glenwood Caverns. I'd like to recognize our Chairman's Council circle members, Alpine Bank, Bank of Colorado, Glenwood Canyon Resort, Glenwood Hot Springs, Hotel Colorado, City of Glenwood Springs, Colorado Mountain College, Courtyard by Marriott, Glenwood Springs Post Independent, Hampton Inn, Holiday Inn Express, KMTS, KREX TV, Residence Inn by Marriott, and thanks to Aspen Glen for hosting this morning's event. Among our guests today we have County Commissioner Mike Sampson and County Commissioner Tom Jankowski and City Council Member Dave Sturgis. Thanks for coming this morning.
And Jim Yelko, County Assessor.
Jim Yelko, where's Jim? I didn't see him. Hey, welcome Jim, thank you for coming. At this time I'd like to introduce Bill Dieter, the Market President of Bank of Colorado and today's sponsor for this event.
Thank you, and thank you to Michael and the Chamber for putting this on. We've got Brian Shawn up here with me. He's going to help present today, and soon you'll understand why we will be in banking forevermore. Hi, I'm Bill Dieter, and I have a great bank, Bank of Colorado.
And I'm presenter Bill Dieter, much younger and more attractive. My name's Brian Shohan. Can you guys all hear me? Do I need this?
You need it.
All right. So thank you, Mike, and thank you guys. We're proud to be able to sponsor this to help educate the community in important topics like energy. So I get a quick moment to talk about the bank and wanted to talk about some of the exciting stuff that we have going on. As some of you may have read in the paper, we're going to be scraping and rebuilding our Glenwood location. Last year we also remodeled our Willits location, and we have another branch in Rifle. So just wanted to let you guys be aware of that. And if you guys ever get time or are in Willits, we have an ongoing art show going on. Changes out every 6 months or so. But without any further ado, I will introduce our first speaker, Christopher Guth, Senior Vice President, U.S. Chambers Institute for 21st Century Energy. Prior to joining the Chamber in 2008, Guth served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Nuclear Energy at the U.S. Department of Energy, where he developed the administration's nuclear energy policies and was also Deputy Assistant Secretary for Congressional Affairs. At the Energy Institute, he is responsible for developing the Institute's policies and initiatives as they apply to the legislative, executive, and regulatory branches of the federal and state. The Chamber's Shell campaign, which analyzes and promotes the widespread benefits of shale energy development in America. He educates policymakers, businesses, energy stakeholders, coalitions, and the public about the importance of a diversified energy portfolio. Please help me in welcoming Christopher Guth.
Good morning, everyone. I love coming to Colorado. I was just mentioning that to Jimmy that. In DC, if I held an event at 7 o'clock, there would be 2 people there. And every time I'm in Colorado, it doesn't matter if I'm in Denver, Western Slope, Pueblo, this will be my 18th trip over the last 2 years to your fine state. It's obviously very important energy because of some activism. It has become very important for the U.S. Chamber to be out here and make sure that business communities and frankly Coloradans across the state understand how important energy is, where it comes from, and frankly how important oil and gas is to the state. So, but that's not all I'm going to talk about. So let me give you a little bit of a scene setter. This is a big scene setter. We're talking globally because not only is that part of the title of I think today's forum, but also literally every single day, global energy becomes more interlinked. And so what's happening in Colorado is impacted by what's happening in Russia, Azerbaijan, South Africa, and so forth. It may seem very remote, but I'll try to give you a little bit of link why that is. So the International Energy Agency projects that by 2040, global demand for energy is going to increase by 56%. Almost all of that is coming from non-OECD countries. That basically means developing countries. And I'll show you my next slide where we explain where that's coming from. But the point is that almost all energy demand is coming from countries that have mature economies that don't have mature technologies and frankly don't have mature environmental standards. Electricity demand alone, 76% increase, so almost doubling in a relatively short period of time when you think about how long it takes to build out the infrastructure that's necessary for a modern society to rely on. When you look around the world, this is one of the most striking things. I'll mention it a couple times throughout this, especially when I get into some of the environmental regulations in the U.S. 1.4 billion people around the world don't have any power at all. 1.4 billion people, no power whatsoever. And so in those countries, those developing countries, where 90% of the future demand is supposed to come from, their leaders have a much different viewpoint and much different goals than developed countries do. Because frankly, whether or not someone has power, aside from having access to potable water, reliable power is the second most correlative statistic to quality of life. I mean, you're talking about a difference between a 60-year lifespan and a 40-year lifespan. You're talking about an average wage globally of somewhere around $15,000 a year to somewhere around $2,000 a year. And so those leaders are driven by something completely different than our leaders are. Leaders in Europe, Australia, Japan, developed countries you want to look at. And so it's important to remember that going into what will be a very major conference at the end of this year to discuss the future of global climate cooperation. It's projected that it will take about $38 trillion just to meet that electrical demand by 2035. That's a boatload of money. In this country, we have investor-owned utilities, we have co-ops, and we as ratepayers generally pay for the infrastructure that is necessary for our utility or for our electric company to bring the electricity that we depend on. Flip the switch, the lights go on. Well, in most of the rest of the world, those utilities are owned by the government. And so this money has to come from somewhere. Most of them are already taxed to the hill. And so a lot of times this money comes from past the hat. And especially as we get into advanced technologies that are significantly more expensive. And I like to put this in here, especially as we talk about oil and gas, is that 90% of the world's oil supply, oil reserves, are controlled by state-owned companies, by national companies. And so in the United States, especially in DC, politicians love to decry big oil. Anytime prices shoot up demonstrably, they love to haul up the CEOs of Shell and Exxon and Chevron and BP and castigate them. But it's important to remember that at the end of the day, all of the publicly traded companies control less than 10%, actually it's less than 8% of the world's oil supplies. And they're competing against government entities. They're competing against entities that have capabilities that private corporations or public corporations don't have either the resources for, and frankly are legally prohibited. For example, China can say, look, acquiring X amount of oil over the next 30 years is a national priority. And it can send its national oil companies out around the world and negotiate with other nations in order to get access to those reserves. It can offer them new factories. It can offer It can offer them weapons. It can offer them small arms, which it frequently does. Now, as nefarious as a lot of people like to make big oil in this country, they're not allowed to offer tanks. They're not allowed to offer AK-47s. And frankly, if they were to bundle the way that the national oil companies do, they would violate antitrust laws in this country. So again, 8% controlled by all of them, not just the big companies that everyone talks about, but all the mom and pops that bring the majority of the oil and gas in this country are competing against national companies. Now here's where that energy demand's coming from around the world. You see to the right, those are all developed countries. OECD is it's a snotty club in Europe of mature economies. And you see that the red is where we are and the blue is the expected growth. You see that there's very little projected growth across those countries. The United States is certainly the biggest, but it's de minimis. Now, you go from the middle to the right, those are developing countries. And you see obviously that huge blow in the middle is China. China is expected to double its energy demand between now and 2035, 2040. They're sort of slowing down their economy for prolonged growth right now, but their energy demand is voracious and it continues to grow. And India also looking to almost double. And so these are the countries where all the energy demand is coming from. And again, they're motivated by different factors, bringing reliable electricity to the masses. Now in this country, excuse me, this is where our government expects energy demand to come from, where it's going. Middle there, that's roughly where we are right now. You see, we have a pretty diversified energy mix, and that's one of the greatest assets that we have. Thanks to the engineers, and frankly, thanks to the geological benefits that have been bestowed upon this country, we have a lot of oil, we have a lot of gas, and we now have a lot of renewables, we have a lot of biofuels. But if you see where we are right now and where the U.S. government expects us to be in 2040, it's not demonstrably different. I mean, you do see renewables growing from 8 to 11%, which is notable, but at the end of the day, fossil fuels still account for about 70% of all energy production, all the way to 2040. Now, this is my public service announcement. Bob Barker always got to do his spay and neuter your pets. No matter what audience I talk to, even if it's people who are a lot smarter on oil and gas issues than I am, I always include this because it's important so much has changed in the last 5 to 10 years when it comes to energy, and it takes a while for that to seep into our public consciousness. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're 5 years old and you started kindergarten back in September, or if you're 95 and you've been teaching civics your entire professional life. We've all been taught that the United States is energy poor, that we're energy gluttons, and our policies reflect that. Now, whether or not we're gluttons, though, that's sort of a subjective term, and I'll leave that for another day. But I will say that we are absolutely not energy poor. If you look at the resources we have, 10 people would come with resources. We need a geologist who's gone out and found these resources. They said, it's here, I can taste it, I can touch it. And their colleagues in the engineering field have developed technology to pull it out of the ground. We've got over 120 years of natural gas, we've got about 200 years of oil, and almost 500 years of coal. If you take it one step further to in-place resources, that's where the geologists have gone out and said, it's here, I can taste it, I can touch it. But the engineering hasn't quite caught up yet, but literally every single day it's sort of down a little further. We've got almost 600 years of gas, 500 years of oil, and almost 10,000 years of coal. Not a misprint, 10,000 years of coal. We are the largest energy base in the world. No other country has more energy than we do. Now, what we do with it, we're a democracy and that's up to us. But it's important to go into those conversations knowing where we stand, because we still have this mindset as a country, and DC is the last to get the message, which is why I spend so much time out in the field, out in the real world, because they hear from you, they hear from your customers, your colleagues, whatever it may be, and ultimately they say, okay, now there's been enough of a shift that I understand. But our policies are set back in the 70s, frankly, especially as it comes to a lot of oil and gas policies, a lot of natural resource policies, a lot of access policies. There are vestiges of the Arab oil embargo, which happened, frankly, a year before I was born. A lot has changed since then. A lot has changed in the last year. A lot has changed in the last 6 months. But yet we still have policies that were reflective of the situation in 1973. Here's a perfect example: access to federal lands. Obviously, there's lots of federal lands in this part of the state, in this part of the world. You see that there's been constant, off and on debate about whether or not things are getting better or things are getting worse. I mean, this is just the numbers. This shows you the number of leases that have been offered and the number of wells that have been permitted over the last 15 years. And you see that we had a high point in 2007, and then it dropped off. I mean, I'm not trying to read anything into there, but numbers are numbers. You may remember back in 2012, there was a lot of banter between President Obama and Governor Romney over this exact issue. Has this administration made access to federal resources more or less difficult? You can make your own judgment, but this is where we are. Now, obviously, shale development is the big story in Colorado. It wasn't necessarily the big story 5 or 6 years ago, although it was a lot out here in the Piceance. But this has been one of the most transformational energy issues this country's ever seen, this world has ever seen. We did a study last year. It was, and as far as I know, still is the first and only national study that looks at the entire macroeconomic benefit of this unconventional revolution. Not just sort of the guys and gals out there with the funny looking hats standing on rig floors pulling stuff out of the ground, but also the build out of the midstream, the new pipelines, the new rail, the new barges, but most importantly the downstream, the sort of manufacturing. What do we do with all this stuff when it comes out of the ground? It doesn't all go, to our house and heat our pasta or warm our water. In fact, most of it is natural gas liquids, and that's frankly the really valuable stuff. That's created a renaissance in manufacturing not more than 10 years after we as a country sort of collectively washed our hands of manufacturing and said we can't compete with the rest of the world. I'll get to more of that later. Well, I'll get to more of that right now. This is where our natural gas consumption is expected to go. You see at the top there, we have industrial consumption, significant increases, and obviously electrical power. This doesn't necessarily reflect all the environmental regulations that have been put in place the last few years, so that's probably going to go up even higher as utilities switch from coal to gas, at least in the near term. But right now, let's focus on the industrial side. This is this is what the stuff coming out of the ground out here in Rifle on the West Slope. This is what this is spawning. An industrial renaissance. Utilizing the natural gas, the methane, as well as the natural gas liquids, what we're seeing is a huge build out of the manufacturing sector. And it's not just refining. It's not just petrochemical. It's things like steel. It's things like agricultural feedstocks, fertilizers. It's things like machines. A lot of different areas that had literally been moribund for the better part of 20 years are now seeing new life because of this major resource that we have in place. Now, this is one of my favorite slides that I use, and it sort of, I think, puts this issue very clear. Ethylene is it is the most central building block when it comes to manufacturing. Plastics, resins, polymers. I mean, there are different ones, there are different types of them, but ethylene and all its derivatives like polyethylene are core to all of that. This is a chart of what it costs to produce a ton of ethylene around the world. And you'll see, disregard the first one, that's the Middle East, because frankly, they don't necessarily have the infrastructure right now to compete against the US, Europe, or Asia, although they're building it out pretty darn quick. If you look, the US and Canada, it costs on the order of about $300 to produce that ton. If you go across the ocean either way, it's about $900 in Europe, $900 in Asia. So that's 3 times more expensive than it is here. And so if you are a chemical manufacturer, if you are a plastics manufacturer, a resin manufacturer, and you were going to invest, where would you go? I mean, this is their single largest input cost, and it's 3 times more expensive around the world. And the reason for that is because Europe and Asia don't have access to the natural gas that we have. So they're forced to use oil. They derive the same molecules to produce these products that make up, I don't know, whatever it is, 75% of everything you find on a shelf at Walmart. Synthetically produced man-made products or man-made ingredients that go into those products. They use oil. And historically, although maybe not right this second, historically, oil on an apples-to-apples basis is significantly more expensive than natural gases. So this is a tremendous competitive advantage in this country. And you add on top of that our electricity rates. This is a little bit of a convoluted chart. It comes from another report we did on electricity diversity. But what it shows is a comparison between the U.S. and our 5 largest trading partners' electricity prices, both in 2001 and in 2011. And the triangle is 2001, and the square is 2011. So you can see between 2001 and 2011, we gained and overtook every single one of our trading partners, save for Canada. They're basically the same as we are. The point is that if you look at Japan and Germany, their electricity rates are twice as expensive as ours are. They're major, I won't say competitors, but they're places that businesses could also invest. So we have this massive supply of natural gas. It's cheap, it's reliable, we also have cheap electricity. What that spawned is this manufacturing renaissance. And the report that we did, if you look at all of the upstream activities, the rig floor and so forth, and you look at all the build out of the midstream, and then you look at the downstream, this manufacturing renaissance, what we found is, as of about last year, 2.1 million jobs were directly attributable to just unconventional oil and gas, not even looking at the conventional stuff, the stuff where you drill straight down, the stuff that we're doing out in the Gulf, the stuff that we've been doing out in western Colorado for 60 years. Just the unconventional stuff, the new stuff. Going out to 2025, almost doubling to 3.9 million. And perhaps even more interesting, government revenue. $75 billion last year. And between now and 2025, we project to be about $1.6 trillion. And even in DC, that's pretty good money, $1.6 trillion. And this is all money that almost no government had been planning on at the state or the federal level 3, 4, 5 years ago. I mean, you and I may go and find a $5 bill in our jeans pocket when we're doing laundry on Sunday and think, man, I forgot I was there, that's great. Well, you go to Colorado, you go to Denver, and they found somewhere in the neighborhood of about $60 billion in their back pocket because nobody was planning on it. Not Governor Higginbotham or not the legislature. This is what you as Coloradans, this money can go to what you as Coloradans expect state to provide, whether it's education or infrastructure, first responders. And again, not expected. Now, it's also been a pretty big boom when it comes to energy security. Again, another convoluted chart, but at least they're pretty colors. What this shows us is where we get our oil from and where we're expected to get our oil from. If you go back to 2006, we imported about 2/3 of all of our oil. That's a lot. We were producing only 1/3 of our own oil. But then we started to import a lot more Canadian oil. And I will certainly say that Canadian oil is vastly different than oil from around the world. Not that the molecules are different, but Canada is our largest single trading partner. Canada is a very reliable trading partner, even if we aren't necessarily always reliable to them, as we demonstrated in the Keystone XL pipeline. But getting oil from Canada is significantly better for this country, both economically and geopolitically, than getting it from the Middle East or getting it from Venezuela. Just on a trade issue, every dollar that we give to Canadians, we normally see about 93 cents return. Every dollar that we give to Venezuela for oil, we see about 8 cents return, as far as our trade. So I would count that as almost as good as American oil. I still want the jobs to be here as opposed to in Alberta, but if they have to be, if we have to give our money somewhere, it might as well be the Canadians. So we have U.S. production increasing. The first two here are U.S. production. Conventional production is going down a little bit, but that's because the unconventional production, shale oil, is increasing. The U.S. production increasing on the order of about 60% between 2006 and now, expected to go out even more. Now that orange stuff is Canadian imports. They're increasing as well. Excuse me. So we're producing more, we're importing more from Canada. And frankly, our demand is basically stable. It's not growing a whole lot. Part of it is a vestige of the Great Recession. Part of it is our cars are becoming more efficient. In a lot more metropolitan areas where less dependent on cars and transportation fuel. So our demand's staying the same. We're producing more, we get more from Canada, something's got to give. And what's given is all that overseas imports. That's the gray stuff. I mean, at this point, we're importing almost no oil from Nigeria. We are importing 1 million barrels a day, 1/16 of our entire supply 3 years ago. What's happening here is making us significantly less dependent on the rest of the world. It's insulating us from price volatility. And in spite of what everyone said, myself included, 3 years ago, you can never drill your way to lower prices. What have we done? We've drilled our way to lower prices. It's because of what happened in the United States. But for the shale revolution, the price of oil never would have dropped the way it did. There's no way that you can argue with that because we are the single largest factor in what has changed in the last 5 years. Now, unfortunately, like with natural gas, in oil, we're a bit of a victim of our own success. We've maybe overproduced. And it looks like we've got a glut on our hands globally. At this point, it's estimated to be about 1 million, 1.5 million barrels. This is out of a daily demand of about 90 million barrels. It's a small dislocation between supply and demand, but it's been enough to see prices decrease by 50%. And in places that are dependent upon oil and gas development for their economy, it's having a profound impact, and frankly, it's probably going to for some time to come. This was a study that was done, or an analysis that was done about 6 weeks ago, and it shows where we were in July versus where we are now as far as profitability of these plays. And if you go all the way to the far right here, Piceance Basin is the least economical right now. In fact, what this analysis estimates is that it's actually negative to produce natural gas on the whole in Piceance. Now that doesn't mean that people aren't still out there drilling wells. Obviously they are, but the rig count has dropped significantly. And most of the production is stabilized at this point. Now thankfully it's not true for the rest of the U.S. And I'm not here to say that this is sort of the new norm. It's just where we are right now. What has ultimately happened is we've seen the DJ Basin out in Weld County, north of Denver, which has sort of been one of the darlings of this whole entire shale development, 50% less rigs than we had in October. That's a pretty big drop-off, especially if you live in Weld County. 38% in Bakken, the Williston Basin. Ultimately, across the country, about 36% drop-off. Most analysts expect it to go probably closer to 50% drop-off total. That's a lot of rigs getting laid down. And every single one of those rigs, you figure that's a crew of 20, 25, 30. That's a lot of people looking for work, at least in the interim. Now, thankfully, what we've seen is the companies aren't laying off as many people as they have in the past. They know that this is somewhat temporary. And more importantly, they've been struggling the last 5 years to get people to run these rigs. The last thing they want to do now is lay them all off and then have to go through the same struggle 5 months from now. Now, I'm not trying to say there are layoffs, because obviously there are, but it's been significantly less than what we've seen in the past. The gas rig count, which is even more important to this part of the state, down 20%. Because not only do we have a drop-off in oil prices, drop in gas prices too. You know, you can't wait for trying. And ultimately in Colorado, down a net of 29 rigs, which may not mean anything to you, but that's about 40%. So it's pretty significant impact. And the question is when is this rig count actually going to catch up with the production drop-off? This is a chart showing production charted against the rig count across the country. Blue is production, red is the rig count. And you see right around October we started to tip down significantly. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending upon how you look at it, the production continues to increase. When is it going to stop increasing? If we're not drilling anymore, we're drilling seasonal less, when is it going to stop increasing? It's very difficult to, unfortunately, answer that question. Sorry, I'm tinkering with my stopwatch, make sure I have the list on here. But we know, and we can't really predict it either. There's been a lot of drop-offs over the course of the last 30 years. But because the production levels of these wells are so unique, I think you probably all heard. I mean, they produce massive amounts, as soon as you spud the well. But they drop off really quick. So there's a school of thought that this lag time could materialize in less production sooner. Well, we haven't seen it yet. We hope to see it relatively soon because that's going to be the demand is still growing. Demand globally is still growing. It's just not going as fast as the rate of production. And so production's already bigger than demand, and it's growing at a higher rate. So at some point, we need to level off so that we can get a bottom-out price. And don't necessarily look at Wall Street for whether or not we're in equilibrium, because they trade on all kinds of things that have nothing to do with the fundamentals of supply and demand. Now, good side of this, if you're in the oil patch, it hurts a little bit. The gasoline price is obviously down significantly. At this point right now, $1 less nationally than we were a year ago. That translates to about $950 per household, year on end. If the prices are $1 less, that's $950 each family, each household is not spending than it otherwise would. I mean, DC, we have problems with stimulus to begin with, but we couldn't even if we could get some sort of magic that gave us magical direction, we could never possibly give a stimulus as good as $950 like that. Now, does that mean that people are all going out and buying houses with this? Well, not necessarily, but it certainly meant that in December, they were buying a whole lot more presents. And it means at this point, actually, car sales are up the highest they've been in the last 4 years. And the automobile dealers attribute it directly to the price of gasoline being so much cheaper. Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about exports, because I really need your help on this. Exports is a significant issue. We're constrained in our ability to export gas and oil. And we have massive amounts, like I told you, and we're glutted. We're producing more than we can consume. And we've got hundreds of years of supply. Well, we're constraining our producers. They're not being able to go out in the global market and fetch the same price that their international competitors are. So we need changes from these 1970s policies so that we can actually go out there and do it. So if you happen to run across when you're members of Congress or Senate, I would certainly encourage you to tell them that, you know what, this is good for Colorado, because it definitely is. You would see more rigs out there, and you would see certainly less layoffs if we weren't constrained by these vestiges of the 70s. And I would be very remiss if I didn't talk about, we can still screw this up. There are a lot of people out there who hate fossil fuels, and they're doing everything they possibly can to make sure they stay in the ground. Obviously, the tip of the spear is Colorado. That's why I've been spending so much time out here over the course of the last year and a half. And that was because, as you know full well, we almost saw a statewide initiative that would have essentially banned hydraulic fracturing in the state. Colorado is very unique. And what we found in the polling was that the majority of Coloradans felt that while oil and gas is important, our economy is new and it's diversified enough that we can live without. We don't want to, but we could live without. Now, I would argue that's preposterous on its face. I mean, oil and gas makes up about 6% of the state's GDP, $30 million a year, 6% of state employment. But the problem is that before those people who felt that way, and most of them were sort of open-minded. That's just they weren't necessarily ideologues either way. But before they would entertain your economic arguments, they wanted you to address the environmental arguments. And frankly speaking, from a chamber perspective, that puts us in weird spots. I mean, I won't speak for this chamber, but I know that most chamber execs like to talk about economic growth and jobs. But, you know, aren't all that comfortable getting up in front of a hostile crowd and talking about well casing standards and fusion of methane. So one of the things that we did was we worked with local chambers throughout the state and went around and put on seminars for them to learn what the facts were and to make them, help them be comfortable standing up to their members, to their community, and explaining how important this is. Because this is ultimately how things are won when you're talking about a real political campaign like this was, is word of mouth. If someone you trust tells it to you, you're going to trust it a lot more than something you read in the newspaper. And we're going to see these come back again in a very short period of time. We know that there's going to be additional attempts. And they've already been, I think 2 have already been filed, 2 statewide initiatives. You know, I haven't read the 9 recommendations that the task force gave to the governor 2 days ago because I've been traveling, but I think it's a good first step. We'll see what the legislature does. But irrespective of what any of them do, there's still going to be attempts to ban it. And it's going to be the voice of business that explains to Coloradans. Because frankly speaking, if you're not associated with the oil and gas industry, you probably either don't trust them, or you at least think, well, they're self-interested. Of course they want to do this, because they make money off of it. And so when normal, average businesses communicate, especially in communities like Glenwood Springs, not the size of Denver, you guys, all and gals, have a much more outsized time, I want to get to one final aspect of this. Switch big gears to utilities, to coal, gas, and using these things to produce electricity. This is a visual depiction of all the clean air and clean water regulations that utilities face now through 2016. It's meant to just show you that there's a morass, and it's very difficult if you are Acme utility and you know that your demand is going to increase over the next 20 years, you need new generation, probably new efficiency as well. But if you make the decision that you need new generation, you will maybe invest $1 billion in a new power plant. You want that $1 billion to last for at least 30 years. So you need to thread the needle and make sure that whatever you invest in is going to be able to survive all of these things. Very difficult to do. There is a narrative, certainly in DC, and I'll be honest, in Western Colorado too, places where natural gas is made, a narrative that the reason we're seeing a decline in coal is because, frankly, natural gas is kicking its butt in the market. It's so much cheaper. And don't get me wrong, I mean, the price of natural gas dropping has had a significant impact on coal. But what this chart shows us is at no point in time ever has natural gas been cheaper than coal on a per BTU basis. I'm not trying to say coal is better than gas, gas is better than coal. I'm just trying to lay the fact out that coal still has an economic advantage over gas, which is to say that these environmental regulations have had a lot more to do with it than the price of the two commodities. Now, I won't get into all the different regulations, but let's just look at one because it's in place right now. The Clean Air Act, it's amazing. And we as Americans should be immensely proud of it. I mean, it's probably the greatest single thing, one of the greatest single things that the federal government has ever done. If you look at where we were 40 years ago to where we are right now, night and day difference. We're at the point now, though, where we've eliminated almost all the criteria air pollutants that the Clean Air Act was designed to eliminate. We're down to like the final 10-ish%. And as any engineer can tell you, the final 10% is exponentially more difficult to remove than the first 10%. And normally the way the Clean Air Act works is predictable. You know that there's intervals. Every so often you have to ratchet down your emissions levels. In the case of mercury, we were down to the last 5%. That's huge. We got rid of 95% of all the mercury that we had coming out of the flues of predominantly coal plants 40 years ago. But instead of allowing more time for engineers to really figure out how to bleed that rock and get that final 5% out, this administration said, well, you know what, we don't have all that much time left. We're not going to be president forever. We're going to make it happen now. The problem is the utilities haven't planned on that. Engineering wasn't ready for that. And so what we're seeing is a major dislocation. This rule that went into effect this year is already closed and is expected to close ultimately somewhere in the neighborhood of 20% of all our coal plants. Now, whether you love or hate coal or are indifferent, that change in such a short period of time is going to have impacts. And those impacts are on reliability and those impacts are on cost. Now, most of these closures are happening in the industrial Midwest, but you see there's a couple of big circles that are in Colorado as well. Excuse me. Last year we had the polar vortex. This year we had the polar vortex again. But all those coal plants in Ohio, Illinois, and Michigan were running at 95%. Now, when the next polar vortex comes around when these plants close in 2020, how are we going to meet demand? We're not talking about, you know, a bunch of pasty Midwesterners sipping on margaritas watching the Super Bowl. We're talking about people needing power to live. I mean, when the temperatures drop to -50 in places where you're not prepared for it, people die. And so who's going to keep the lights on there? The problem with the Clean Air Act, as great as it is it doesn't require the EPA to look at that. Now, EPA claims that they're looking at reliability factors, but they don't have an answer for this. They don't have an answer for this in parts of Colorado too. There will be dislocation. Let me finish off because it's not just that one rule. It's rule upon rule upon rule. Now, you probably heard about the climate change rules, the greenhouse gas regulations. The only thing I'll say there is that now that we're regulating greenhouse gases in the Clean Air Act, we know what the final result is. The final result is at some point in the future, I can't tell you precisely when. It might be 40 years, it might be 80 years, but at some point in the future, we will no longer use coal or natural gas to produce electricity. That's how the Clean Air Act works. It's a guarantee. Ratchet down every 5 years until we've eliminated that pollutant, in this case CO2. Now, I will say the one exception, the one possible exception, is U.S. engineering. I love U.S. engineers. They built the energy world. But I'm not prepared to bet the economic future of this country on engineers coming out with a technological solution that allow us to continue to utilize coal and gas. But make no mistake, that's the path that we're on. And perhaps even more troubling is the ozone. Ozone is one of those pollutants that the Clean Air Act was designed to eliminate. The administration 2 months ago proposed a new standard. We literally, excuse me, the administration literally just finalized the previous standard from 6 years ago, 2 weeks ago. So we haven't even fully embraced that and got that in place. We have a new one in place. What this could do, and there's a study coming out today, I don't have the data unfortunately for you, but what it's going to show is that somewhere in the neighborhood of 60%, 60 to 65% of the entire country will be in non-attainment. Now, you don't need to know what ozone is, you don't need to know what non-attainment is. What you do need to know is that it means no growth. The way the Clean Air Act works, it says if you did not meet the standard that we set out for you, you're in non-attainment. This county is in non-attainment. If that county is in non-attainment, you cannot get a Clean Air Act permit to build a factory, a refinery, a road, unless you eliminate 1.5 times the ozone emissions from whatever you're going to build. By definition, that means no growth. Now, the economy is doing relatively well, but it's still teetering a little bit. And I think when you look at 60, maybe more, I don't know, we would have to wait for the final data. When you think of 60% of the country coming into non-attainment for a standard that we haven't even implemented the last one yet, that's going to have some pretty profound impacts. So you'll hear a lot more about that over the next few months, because as much as the climate regulations get a lot of attention and really drive the debate in Washington and amongst the ideologues on both sides, ozone has the impact, the possibility of being considerably more impactful on you, your everyday lives. Because parts of western Colorado that are currently in attainment will all of a sudden not be in attainment. And from a chamber perspective, as a small business perspective, as a local business perspective, it's going to impact. It may not impact you directly. You may not be going out to build something, but it's going to impact one of your clients, one of your customers, and it's going to impact the economy. So keep an eye on that. We'll hear more from us later about that. And at the end of the day, you guys are way more powerful than we are. The U.S. Chamber, we do a pretty good job in D.C., but the secret of it all is because of you. It's because of the small businesses around the country. It's because of the local chambers. We can turn those voices on your elected representatives. That gives us 1,000,000 times more weight than the highest priced lobbyist in D.C. So with that, thank you very much for the time and the opportunity to come speak to you. My apologies for running a little long, but hopefully it was worth it.
All right, so actually, do you have 5 minutes for questions?
I
if
do.
there's any questions? Go ahead.
I think you were first, ma'am.
You touched on it a small bit, but on the local level, I'm only going to assume that the burden that you're speaking to is, let's say, quote-unquote, oil and gas. And when are we going to frame the narrative, the false narrative that it's not a good thing, it's celebrated in the 1920s, almost 1 million people either died as a direct result of a hot or cold winter, as you mentioned. And you also touched on John Kemp. If people don't think that I care, then I'm going to care about what I have to say. So how do we celebrate this fossil fuel that is saving lives? And since 1985, our air pollution has decreased 50%. And these are not the truths. They're not spoken. They're not in the limelight. And I guess my biggest concern is, when did we stop caring about the truth? And how can you help us? I mean, I'm kind of full-time all the time with these messagings, the message. How can we, at a larger level, make an impact?
It's tough because the industries as a whole do a horrible job at being their own cheerleader. Partially because it's corporate America, and corporations don't like to risk additional exposure by going out and saying how great they are. But also it's because we always take what we have for granted. And if you were to be supplanted into, sub-Saharan Africa, and you had to fend for yourself, and had zero electricity and zero water, well, that might change your perspective, but obviously that's not gonna happen. So it's from our perspective, that's why we spend so much time in Colorado, and why you've seen industry sort of peak their ears up when they were threatened with having all oil and gas removed from the state. I mean, there's companies that have tens of billions of dollars of investment in the state. And you can't just write that off. I mean, yeah, you can, but it hurts really, really bad. That's why they finally sort of woke up and said, look, we have to do this the right way. We can't just throw a few TV ads out there, smiley people about how great oil and gas is. You have to learn what makes Colorado stand. And that's what CRED, Colorado for Responsible Energy Development, and the American Petroleum Institute did. Is they spent 6 months doing nothing but market research, doing polling, doing focus groups, and really sort of stratifying characterizing the electorate. Where is it? I mean, obviously you got 30% of people who support oil and gas no matter what. You got 15% of people who hate oil and gas no matter what. And those people in between, how do you supplant the misinformation they've been given or they may have picked up on the radio or on the internet or over coffee somewhere with actual facts? And so that's really what the campaign has been about. It's just education, putting it out there. People distrust oil and gas companies. So even when they put out all the information that sometimes they're castigated for not providing, people say, well, but we don't trust you. It's from you, obviously. It's because it's people like you and me who don't work for oil and gas companies. That's where it works. And we know the chamber brand. I mean, it varies from community to community, but the chamber, normally across the country, last year it was about a 72% approval rate. And like I said, as you get into a smaller community, less than 100,000 people, less than 50,000 people, that gets bigger and bigger. And I'm not saying the chamber is the end all be all, because the chamber is what you all as members are. But the point is that you are pillars in your community. And getting out there in your church, Boy Scout troop, whatever the case is, and just saying, man, did you know that oil and gas is 8% of our economy? What do you think would happen if we pulled 8% out of the economy? I mean, it would crumble overnight. I mean, yeah, we would recover, sure, but we might have to go through that. And then to your point, the benefits of fossil fuels, that's a tougher one. For those of you who ever want to get into it, there's an awesome book that just came out about 3 months ago called The Moral Case for Fossil Fuels. And it goes through and it makes a very compelling argument about how fossil fuels, if you look at everything, net positive, net negative, how fossil fuels do significantly more benefit for the world than they do negative. But that's something that I think most society is not really prepared to entertain yet. You have to start with just fending off the wolves at the gate, which is these local bands and these statewide bands. But I would say, please keep on keeping on, and I'm happy to talk to you on the side. Whatever we at the U.S. Chamber can do to help, we definitely will. Sir?
I was just going to ask if your PowerPoint would be available.
Sure.
Well, because it was very interesting. Up to what date was that prepared? Because
some of it was prepared yesterday, last night at 1 a.m. Because I say that only because the Department of Energy releases data once a week, and it's on Wednesdays. So I was traveling, and if you might have seen, Denver got some snow yesterday, and traveling was a little sketchy. But so I got the data yesterday. So all the production numbers and much of it is updated through yesterday. Some of it maybe a year ago. It just kind of depends on what the data is, but it should be dated on every single one.
it seemed very consistent with what I heard.
There's a lot of data out there. You just got to know how to manipulate it so that people can appreciate it. Sir?
Thank you. That was a great presentation. My concern, and I guess I must admit I'm a tree hugger, but I'm an oil and gas industry junkie because I agree that our success is built upon it. But my concern is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce putting their eggs in this basket alone. And the trend that I'm seeing is that the venture capital is going where there's less volatility. The people coming out of college don't want to be in the oil and gas industry because of the volatility and the job market. And so I fear that we're going to lose our competitive edge if we put all our eggs in this basket. So can you speak to those two trends of venture capitalism and the engineers that you mentioned we need to solve this crisis?
Yeah, first, let me say that this isn't necessarily a reflection of our entire platform. I mean, I'm here in Colorado, and so that was kind of, and obviously it's on the front page of every newspaper, oil and gas. I focus a lot more on that. We have a tremendous number of folks who are in biofuels, in electrical renewables, as well as manufacturing of efficiency products. So we love that stuff too. But if you go back to the first slides I showed, where the amount of energy we get right now from fossil fuels and the amount of energy the government expects us to get from fossil fuels 20 years from now, it doesn't change. It doesn't mean that keep on the way things are. I mean, we very much want to see more and more money go into DOE to the national labs, because that is what has really built energy technology across the country and across the world. We do sometimes have some issues with how the government picks winners and losers within those areas. You tend to have some unintended consequences, shall we say. A good example is on the climate rules that are out right now. They don't count existing nuclear. Renewables get fully counted towards complying with these carbon caps, but nuclear only gets 6% counted. Now, irrespective of what you think about nuclear, if your goal is to try and limit the amount of carbon dioxide that goes into the atmosphere, nuclear power provides exponentially more electricity than renewables do. But more importantly, it's baseload, meaning that it runs 24/7. Renewables today can't do that. They're still intermittent. They still need fossil fuels to back them up. So if your goal, if you think that climate change is an existential threat, and your goal is to limit CO2 as much as possible, policies like this that lift up renewables over nuclear to the point that nuclear plants are closing, it's nearsighted. So venture capital. Well, yeah, venture capital is definitely very sexy when it comes to high tech, both green and the normal sort of Silicon Valley tech. But I would sort of make the argument that if you look at where capital is going, the energy technology field across the entire landscape is the new sort of IT, the IT of the early 2000s. And more of it is going into this, the oil and gas stuff, and frankly coal, than is going to any sort of alternative stuff. And that's only because larger scale. While it's volatile, it's certainly more consistent returns. And because these regulations are causing demand for it. I mean, if engineers can come up with a way to economically remove remove CO2 from coal, our problems are solved, at least from a country standpoint. The problem is we have the technology, but it takes a third of all the electricity that power plant produces just to run the technology that captures the CO2. So 1 out of every 3 electrons is essentially going somewhere other than the customer who's paying you for it. We're not quite there yet. If you look at where college graduates are going, I mean, don't get me wrong, I mean, there is an issue with millennials, and I kind of go through your point too about perception of these things. And we could sit down over a beer or coffee and talk all day about how that evolves and how it might evolve in the future. But when you look at what degrees they're going into, we've seen the number of petroleum engineers skyrocket by about 300-fold over the last 5 years. And there's a lot more people going into that than the environmental service degrees right now. They see who's getting paid. Whether they bite their tongue and say, man, I hate those fossil fuels, but I want to make 140 grand too. They're still going into those things. So, they're Americans, I guess. That's the beauty of it. Happy to talk with you a little bit more about that later.
This will be the last question for time.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm in a similar demographic as Dan. I'm a Republican graduated in Boulder, so.
Hey, if I lived here and I was Californian, I would hunt a lot of trees myself.
Right. Specifically on the demand side, the Piceance Basin produces a pretty dry gas. What about Mexican power? I've heard a lot of rumblings that they're going to convert their coal power plants to natural gas power plants, and that would affect us. And then what about exporting our gas to the rest of the world? How do we move the needle on that?
First, on demand side, I would look at all of North America. Mexico is a huge opportunity because there's been a lot of coverage about how Mexico is liberalizing its oil and gas policy, and for the first time in 60 years, outside companies can invest in oil and gas production there. What the newspapers don't cover is that they've also liberalized their electricity sector too. And so U.S. utilities can go in there and compete against the state-owned company to try and make this happen. A modern gas plant is cheaper and more efficient than anything they have there. And obviously there's a lot of gas in the Southwest and all the way through Texas. So that's a huge demand. A lot of my members are navigating that brand new landscape right now. We fully expect to see a lot of U.S. gas to go there. We still have a little bit of an issue with cross-border pipelines in that the infrastructure is not as robust as we need it to be. But if you look at the fuel switching in this country, because of the different regulations, on top of Mexican demand, I mean, we see pretty significant incremental growth over the next 20 to 30 years. But at the end of the day, we've got a lot of natural gas too. So supply is way up here, even if demand increases. I mean, I'm not here to predict the price, but every time price ticks up, all of a sudden you see 15 new oil rigs out there, or gas rigs, and they always tend to equilibrate. From a consumer standpoint, it's awesome. From a producer standpoint, not so good. And on exports, I think the market is basically taking care of itself. You heard me mention that we can't export natural gas or oil. But we can't export natural gas, you just have to mother may I and get a special permit, actually several from the Department of Energy, which violates, frankly, our commitments to international trade, the World Trade Organization. Right now, there's been 4 facilities that have been licensed or are under construction to export liquefied natural gas all over the world.